Hi, and welcome to this video where I'm going to be diving into the opening for the show To Be Hero X, and specifically looking quite closely at the lyrics of the opening and a little bit of the iconography or images of the opening. The reason being that unlike your generic anime opening, which has, very cool sounds and images that are, tangentially related to the show, or more specifically, like are a spoiler of the narrative, I think that this one is more interesting because I think my working theory, honestly, is that this opening is from the voice of X or from the perspective of X himself, the character. And anyone who knows about the show knows that the titular character doesn't actually appear in the show. So if you've already seen the series, spoiler alert, this sort of relies on understanding the material from episode 19, which is the most recent episode at the time of making this. If you haven't seen the series before, then this is quite the odd one to jump into, but hopefully you enjoy and hopefully this inspires you to watch and welcome on this rabbit hole. But more specifically, for those who have seen the series, as you probably know, or maybe you don't know, the show To Be Hero X doesn't follow like a straight linear story, and a lot of the information that we have about the characters and about the series isn't actually in the opening or the song or the episodes. Rather, a lot of the information actually comes from like videos on YouTube and official posts from the show or from the official accounts. For example, there's actually a breakdown on like what each episode is meant to be. So I'll take you to that now. So, for example, we can see here that the first four episodes are meant to be about the character of Nice, or for those who know, Lin Ling. Then we have Isol, who we know is not the first Isol, but actually the second Isol. Then we have Lucky Sion, Queen, who has 2 episodes to herself, Lolly, who had 2 episodes, Ghostblade, the Johnnies, which we've just gotten to Johnny's most recent episode. And now the next episode is supposed to be some mystery episode following an unknown thing. And then we're going to have Dragon Boy, Who, and then the character himself, X. So the character the story is named after doesn't really appear formally until the very end. And we know that, like, for anyone who's seen, doesn't appear until like episode 10-ish, in the middle of Queen's arc. But enough about the background of this. I'll take us to some other relevant pieces of media, but I'm going to jump right now into the focus of the video, which is the opening itself. I always knew where I stood. So the first line here is, I always knew where I stood. I tried to be so... Then the next line is, I tried to be so good. And I think this is a good place to pause. And spoiler warning, I'm going to be pausing a lot if I didn't already say that. But we see here in the images title cards or cards for all the 10 main heroes in order from 10 to X, who is number 1. And if we look at the lyrics, it says, I always knew where I stood. I tried to be so good. This, normally when you hear someone talking about I knew where I stood or where my standing is, tends to imply someone who realizes that they're not at the top, or someone who has a low self-esteem, or someone who thinks of themselves as quite low relative to others. I understood that this is my place, and I tried to be so good, implying that whoever this person is, who I argue is X actually speaking to us, is saying that they've always tried to be a generally good person. But obviously, all of this is just my current thinking, and anyone who disagrees can drop down a comment, or I'm welcome to be corrected. And also, as the series unfolds, expectations might be subverted, I might be completely wrong, and I'm really interested in seeing what episode 20 does for us. Look at me now, I don't know how, but I'm a real... So, the next line, I think, better lead to what I was saying earlier. So before I said the person who spoke said that, this is where I stand. And then the next few lines are, look at me now. I don't know how, but I'm a real hero. And when we see this, who do we see? We see this mysterious figure in like regular clothes who becomes the titular character of X. and it says, I don't know how, but I'm a real hero, which implies that this person didn't expect to become a hero, but now they are, and they find themselves to be in this place. And what is really interesting about the character of X is that we know that X himself doesn't have a lot of trust value. And the way the system works here is that characters are stronger and eventually become X based on having a lot of trust from other people who believe in them. And we know that X himself, when he was introduced, didn't have that and doesn't have that. So maybe this gives us an insight into the character of X, not really having the expectation of himself becoming a hero or recognizing that he doesn't have a lot of trust value. If we need a reminder, I'll quickly just point it to us. So we have here where X is introduced into the series.
And her opponent, a mysterious contestant who eked into the top 10 right before the matches. His name is yet to be registered into...
So we have here an explanation that X is this complete unknown. His name is not even known, and we know from this video that X eventually wins the fight. So even though, X doesn't fall within this trust system, which is a surprise to everybody, perhaps it was also a surprise to X himself, and he made an active decision. And one thing I think is kind of important, keep a close look at the language of the opening as we continue to go. I think that when X is talking to us, or when this voice is being spoken to us in the lyrics, it might be around the time of this actual fight between Queen and X. But I'll explain further as we go. I'm a real hero. So what's interesting here is that it says, I'm a real hero. We have X dropping these chess pieces, and we know from the iconography of the show that a lot of these characters, especially the heroes, are being manipulated into becoming heroes, their trust values being controlled. I think a big part of this discussion is about Lin Ling replacing Nice, and also about the new Easel replacing the old Easel, and how these people really are just tools that are being controlled. And interesting here, X himself drops his coin and now appears as a chess piece. So maybe he's inserting himself into this. So here, I think is what leads me to believe that this opening is sort of situated around the time that X fights Queen. It says, no hiding in the shadows, time to strut. I think that this means that, like, whoever this character is, or whatever the author or narrator is saying, is that once they got their powers, no point in hiding in the shadows, which eliminates someone like Ghostblade. It's time to strut. And I think this is one, part of the aura farming that is inherent to X, but also two, a display of, like, when he went to go fight Queen, he was this unknown coming from the shadows, and it was time for him to show off and take his place. And that's interesting here, because this kind of, I think, leads from it. So it says, I'm going to make a splash to make this cut. Obviously, he made a dynamic entrance. It made quite the splash after the scene, immediately becoming X. But I think the word cut is actually kind of interesting too. There are two things about this. The first is just, the general surface level of, like, the word cut sounds like snap. We see him already preparing his fingers to snap, and his powers are in relation to snapping. But also you can read his cut as, like, changing something, cutting in between something, maybe being a shit disturber, and that's exactly what X does when he goes to fight Queen. He completely upends this system of this entire tournament that works on a person who has high trust value should be winning, and X completely disturbs that. And maybe even on a further deeper level might imply that X is using his powers more specifically to rend or cut something in the series. I suggest that might be something related to Zero and all, like, the trust value and the negatives, but let's let the video do the rest of it, talking, and the opening continues. To stop again, but what I find super interesting about this, and I want you to keep a note of this, is that the previous lines are all about I, but this line starts with you gotta believe. So this is really interesting because it's saying you gotta believe, and now we're having images of all the other heroes, and we know that those heroes' powers operate on the trust value. They need other people to believe. But if we take this back to a discussion of X, and if we take it from the perspective that X is the one speaking to us, he's saying that these others have to believe that he's free. Why? Well, we don't know yet, but that'll be interesting to see. Another interesting line here, picture your planet in disharmony. What does that imply? Outside of having a really cool image of this heart bound by these chains and, what might be these shackles on society? Maybe it's the trust system, maybe it's fear. We don't know yet. I think it might be trust, and I think others might agree with me, but who knows? But what's really important is the lyric here, which is that the planet in disharmony. It might suggest that underlying this, there's something more nefarious about the trust system, or more nefarious that's happening in the background that we're just not aware of quite yet. Jump into the night. So what's super interesting about this line is that we have the heart that's being bound exploded, and if we take those binds to be the trust system, then maybe it's a symbolization of X exiting that system. And we know X, as this unknown, has his power. I think a lot of people in the community and who watch To Be Hero X believe that X's power, or the source of his power, is his self-belief, and that he doesn't need to be bound by the regular trust system based on how he won that fight. And that explosion of the heart might suggest or point to us that, again, that this really is X speaking, and that he's not bound by that. And we have it's saying jump into the night. So maybe it's when he got his power, he's immediately going into action. And again, suggesting that he got his power later in life. Another interesting image of this, too, is that we see Nice, or potentially Lin Ling, jumping down from this freedom. And we know that the whole concept of Lin Ling's arc was about, Nice taking his own life because he felt bound by something. And Lin Ling trying to escape from some of those shackles and make an identity for himself. So here's an interesting one. We get back to I gotta, and it's saying I gotta make a difference. General hero stuff. Interesting though, I'm moving with a purpose. What's that purpose? I think many would be led to think that that purpose is to become X, and maybe that was what X's thought was when he was becoming X and when he was fighting Queen. I think there might be more there, but that's just speculation. I think that when X got his powers, he might have realized something more serious about Zero and all that stuff that's implied in the Easel arc. But we'll have to wait and see. So interesting thing here. Obviously, just flagging. The opening is called Inertia, and now we're having lines specifically about inertia. But important to this is, we'll see here on the screen, X's arm comes into, and he starts snapping. He snaps, and we have the usual image of him going from 2D to 3D, which I think also points us back to like what happened in Yan Shen's arc, the new Easel's arc and Nice's arc, where like there's shifts between 2D and 3D, which we don't actually see in the earlier arcs prior to X's introduction as X. So this suggests that X probably got his power sometime slightly before he fought Queen, and we don't really see the snap or the move to 3D yet, and that like X is probably doing stuff in the background when we see those shifts happening. And I think that X's episode is probably going to have like an explanation of the non-linear fashion of the show and what X is doing at each relevant point. But we know that X has a role in some of the other characters becoming heroes. For example, Lucky Xion, which I'll show you now, in case you need a reminder. So what we see here is that Xion, when she's at her lowest, lost her powers, and then she gets a coin. And we know that coin is something generally shown with X a lot. He tends to be flipping his coins. And then we see here the same figure, or something similar to the figure in the opening that becomes X, the regular guy in his costumes. You can see other character videos with X that show it. There are some really great ones on YouTube. I won't show them in their entirety because I think they deserve to be watched on their own. But we see here that X is the person who helps Xion actually start her path in being a hero. And I think that this shows us that X is probably meddling in a lot of the stuff that's going on with those heroes. And also maybe helps us understand a little bit more about what's happening in that line earlier when we saw all of the heroes and it says, "You gotta believe that I'm free." But jumping back into the opening, obviously we see a move in between 2D and 3D. Honestly, don't know why we have an image of X missing a face. I'll leave people who are better at analysis to get that to it. My best guess is probably just that like it shows an incompletion of something. And then we see people aspiring to become X. But I suggest that probably isn't the end of it. We see here that it says, "Stubbornly I will believe." And then we see an image of the corporate people who are sort of pulling the strings of a lot of the heroes. And we see iconography of like heroes like Queen, as well as a lot of like the evil, which is probably associated with Zero. We know that these guys are sort of playing games with the lives of these heroes, and specifically to make profit, which they say quite explicitly. But it says in the lyrics, "Stubbornly I will believe," which we know X's power is likely related to his self-belief. So stubbornly I will believe. And I think having this image here shows a juxtaposition. He needs to have his self-belief because he's fighting against this or something related to this. He's fighting against the manipulations or machinations or the evil that's underlying these guys or what they're doing. And he needs his self-belief to do that. Again, negative image associated with those guys, and X saying, "I will believe." Also, never really helps when you got a pyramid with a single eye and an Illuminati sort of codedness. You're probably not on the right side of history there, buddy. And then we saw there in the palm of the hand, the Hero's Tower, which is just, I think, further iconography of it's in the palm of their hand. They control it. And then we see here the original easel, and we see the tower being built, and it's saying each of the various heroes who became X, and it's saying, "Is it my turn to be the hero?" Which is obviously an implication of like, is it my turn to be X? If we take it to be X speaking, it's about like, when's my turn? And we're seeing here each of the individual people who became X and the paths and the turn order. So we obviously started with the original easel, then we went to Johnny's dad, then we go to Vortex. We have these two figures we haven't met yet. We have Smile, and we know that in the anime we saw Smile versus Bua, who loses to X. Then we have DJ Shindig, and then we have X with the line here, "I gotta be the hero." We saw the turn order. We saw that it's now X's turn to actually be a hero, and it's saying he has to be the hero. Why? Well, I mean, on the surface level, it might just be like, I want to be a hero. But I think it's probably deeper because here we have some sort of image of the negative. We see Zero, or an image of Zero. Hopefully you saw that. But I think it implies that X is fighting against something deeper, but I could be completely wrong, so I won't focus on that too in depth. So again, super interesting here. If you recall at the very beginning, I said that like it sounded like whoever was speaking about this had low self-esteem and then suddenly came into power. And then it says here, "All my life they said that I was strange." We had X standing at the top of the tower, having become X, and we know from the story that X himself in the lore has been X for a couple of years post his fight with Queen. But it says, "All my life I've been." They said that I was strange, implying that X, wasn't always this well-liked guy. But now we see him standing at the top of the tower. He snaps his fingers and transitions from 2D to 3D. But we see some sort of water here, or some sort of weird image. It's inverted. And now it says, "But I knew I could be the change," as he's descending from the tower. That I could be the change. I still ain't done enough. Not even. So interesting. X, even though he's at the top, he's snapping. It's not enough. He hasn't done enough, as the lyrics say. He's not even close. that suggests being X wasn't enough. There's more that he's doing, and there's more that he needs to do. And we know that the story of him being X isn't the end there, because it doesn't end with him becoming X. If anything, it just happens sort of randomly in the middle. I think that explains why we have this jumping around. I think the first couple arcs with Nice and Young Shin are about to give us, or were meant for some world building, some context, giving us about the trust system, about how we got there, as well as character introductions. Then we got the stories with like Queen, Shion, Lolly, Ghostblade, and the Johnnies to give us some context about the prior X's and the world. And now, when we're going to see this mystery episode 20, it's probably going to give us more introduction to X, what's happening in the world, and what X is trying to prevent with all of this like weird stuff that's happening between trust value and fear. I could be completely wrong. There have been times in this story that have completely subverted what I thought was going to happen. Like, for example, I thought that Johnny's character was less naive and probably more calculating in his actions and getting close to Ghostblade. I was completely wrong about that. So I'm really curious to see what happens. That sort of rounds off this opening. I'll leave you just with a little bit more context. So we see here, like, this is one of the official trailer videos that give us some insight into the characters. So we see here X again with the iconography of like him in the regular suit, and then him as a hero, and then him on the chessboard. And then talking about like him being sick of working overtime until midnight, and him using his powers. Don't know if that overtime reference is to like him as an office worker, which we know he does, or if it's a reference to him working late at night as a hero. I think it's probably the former, which is that like it's saying he was sick of like his regular life and being a weirdo and not really having a lot of people close to him, and his transition to being a hero. If you look at other videos that are like PVs, we see that like X is usually here by himself doing his work at his office. People are talking about X in real time, so he's still like continuing doing his job, and they're talking about like the tournament and talking about the snap. We see that Smile is still around, so whatever Smile incident is hinted at in the Nice arc hasn't happened yet. And then like X, he's standing here or sitting here by himself. He snaps. People don't even really notice that he's gone. So he really is a strange person or weird. With all of that information in that context, there's obviously more stuff that I can point to, but I think that this has been an interesting foray into the story. I think that this opening for the series, not only sounding really cool, actually is a narrative structure, beat for beat, as to the thoughts or internal monologue of X that's going to be expounded on later. And I'm curious to see if that this analysis is correct or if I'm completely wrong. And if anyone has any thoughts, suggestions, questions, concerns, drop them and let me know. And really look forward to the next episode. Take care.